I will call this meeting of the Finance and Labor Relations Committee to order. Item 2, declaration of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof. Seeing none. Item 3, opening remarks. I'm going to just say that as you can see from the reports, we're still at 8.6%. So let's have a care and govern ourselves accordingly. At the end of the meeting, there may be discussion on next steps. There probably will be discussion on next steps. So let's carry on. Item 4, delegations, none scheduled. Item 5, receipt of correspondence. We received something from the Chamber of Commerce. I expect everybody read it. Can I get a motion to receive? Councillor Ritzma and Councillor Clifford. If there's no questions, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Item 6, report of the Acting Director of Corporate Services. 6.1, budget responses. Carmen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The intent of this report was really just to highlight for Council the summary of responses from the survey, and a couple of things to note that I'll highlight for you. We did only have 24 responses received. The prior year survey resulted in 95 responses. I can't really comment one way or another why that is or what. I'm a bit surprised, to be perfectly honest, given the 8.6 figure that's been tossed around, but it is what it is. And I've highlighted some of the, I'll say, statistical responses in the report, body of the report, and then the qualitative or commentary responses are attached as an attachment. Couple of things that I thought were noteworthy within the response, statistic responses is item number 4, where about half of the respondents understand that enhancing services likely means increases to taxes. And so, you know, they would be interested or receptive to increases in their taxes if they thought that they were maintaining our existing infrastructure or receiving additional benefits. So, and then the remaining 50% want to see taxes go down. So it is split down the middle, but I thought it might be a little bit more strong one way or another in that answer. But and then the other one I wanted to point out was, you know, in number 7, where overall either, you know, 42. So about 70% of the respondents either are satisfied or didn't have a comment one way or another with our overall services that we provide with the tax dollars, whereas 29% were dissatisfied with the services. Again, these are some, you know, we have to take these with a bit of a grain of salt given the number of respondents, but it is something that, you know, we do want to at least consider in our deliberation process. Something else that hasn't really been touched on in the past with surveys is you know, responding to these actual comments and feedback that we receive. So that's something that as staff we would like to you know, try to address some of the specific comments that came back, as well as some of the general overall perspective. So that's something we'll work on as we get through the budget itself. And I'm open to any questions if anybody has any about the report.
Councillor Vasilakis.
So I'm just gonna, I think I brought up this point that I brought up the very first year I was on council, and I continue to do so. If we're going to do surveys for any number of projects or budget, we really have to be careful of non-responder bias. 24 responses is really, it is statistically meaningless, and so it's very, very difficult without actually taking, and I noticed in the report there was some there's the idea to expand, to use bang the table to try to get better response rate so that we can actually get some meaningful information from the consultation, and I think that's really important. I do continue to be disappointed in the number of respondents that we get, but at the same time, then it's maybe telling us that we need to try some different things to get people to engage in the process. And that's just my comment again on non-responder bias.
Thank you. I think I saw Jody's hand first. Jody?
Thank you. Yeah, just a comment on, I think the timing wasn't the greatest this year, and I don't remember last year exactly, but it sort of flew under my radar, where last year I guess I noticed it and I, promoted it a lot on social media. So I think maybe it was so close to the holidays that perhaps that was a bit of an issue as well. But I agree with Kathy, using Bang the Table or trying some different approaches would probably be a good idea as well. I'd also like to note, I personally received about 20 emails with regards to the climate change plan and the climate change coordinator. So I would just note that as a response level that was pretty high, even compared to the survey. So, and I think Mr. Crinklaw let me know that he's going to be addressing that during his presentation. So I'll bring it up again then. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Councillor Ingram.
Thank you. I just wanted or wondered if in the future, when we're doing these surveys related to the budget, if we could include some questions related to asset management, whether the person filling it out is aware of our asset management plan, and if they're aware of the lifespan of some of our capital assets, that might be a little bit more helpful for the people that are filling the survey out, so they can see in relation to what we're using the budget for, how we're making those decisions.
Yes, Carmen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to respond to that, that's a great piece of feedback. Thank you. And it is something that, as an asset management proponent, that I really wanted to expand upon, but felt somewhat limited in a couple of areas, just in my newness to the organization, but also the ability to provide additional information to accompany the survey was kind of limited, but the Bang the Table tool will allow us to provide some educational pieces as well as ask the question. So thanks for that, because I think we're headed there for sure.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
I had someone call me and ask me if we could explain what recoverables are. I told them what I felt it was. And then just before the meeting, I Google searched it through capital and operating and today's meeting, and I could only find it was related to the curling. So I'm not sure where else they were seeing it, but if you could do a brief explanation, it would help other readers that or listeners that are interested.
Carmen.
Would you like me to address that now, or in the response document? Wasn't clear about the question, sorry.
Councillor Henderson.
They wanted to know what recoverables are in our
Sure.
budget.
Okay, I can address that. We use that term internally, or as I call it a revenue source, in cases where we provide a service or we do an initial, I'll say, billing of a service, and then we recover the funding from somewhere else. So it might be a case where we have a shared service, or we have an agreement with an outside party where they're going to reimburse us for part of the cost or that sort of thing. Did that help?
That's basically what I said. I said it might even, I wasn't sure how the HST comes back. And I said, like, we get that recovered, and, maybe people are paying for things, and yeah. And the curling, it was, dealing with, it was coming out of the reserves, but it ended up being 1,000 more or something.
So further to that, with the HST treatment, so it really does depend on the nature of the expense and the nature of the agreement that we have with the party. Sometimes, if say it's we're working with a community group that it ends up being something that we're going to retain control over, say a playground or something like that they're contributing to, then yeah, we might, or we are able to recover the HST, but in some cases we can't act as an agent and it's strictly a flow through, then we can't recover it. So really, their HST rules are kind of complicated, but you generally have the gist of it, yes.
Okay, thank you. If there's no other questions, I will entertain a motion. Moved by His Worship and seconded by Councilor Burback. All those in favor? Most if any, that's carried. Item 6.2, current 2022 draft budget status. Proposed adjustments and impact as at January 17, 2022. Carmen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've highlighted within the report some of the, or all of the, I guess, proposed impacts that we're looking at making changes to from your original document. They are numbered 1 through 7 within the report. If anybody has any particular questions, I will be happy to answer those. And we can get into a little bit more detail when we talk about the budget. But I will also point out that since writing this report, I have several more that you'll see in the presentation that I'm going to do following this report. So stay tuned on that. But the impact of the ones in this report come to an adjustment or a reduction to the proposed levy increase of $445,000. So that does translate into bringing the 8.6% down a little bit more. So we can talk about that again when we get into the meat of the budget. But I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any on the particular items that are being adjusted.
Does anyone have any questions? Seeing none, I will accept the motion to receive for information. Councillor Clifford and Councillor Ingram. All those in favor? Carried. Oh, I see the deputy clerk has to stand up.
Through the chair, sorry, just to clarify, that included the authorization for the proposed changes to the budget as noted?
I expect so. I will ask the mover. That's, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'll ask the question again. All those in favor? Opposed to any, that's carried. Item 6.3, 2022 draft capital budget and 2023 to 2031 capital forecast presentation. I will hand this over to the acting director, please.
Perfect. Give me just a second here. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Just trying to get. So our sort of format for the rest of the evening is to look at the overall capital budget and the forecast. So I will draw your attention to the document within your binders that it starts within the capital budget tab. And for those of you following along electronically, it is the capital budget where the capital budget documents begin. And there's a document in there that shows the capital forecast as a summary. It says for illustration purposes at the top. And so I don't know if everyone has that or if you'd like it projected on the screen. I'm looking for a bit of direction. It's a very small print if I put it on the screen, but I'm happy to do that if not everyone has their binders.
Everyone's okay with what we're doing? Okay, carry on.
Okay, perfect. So this is really just, I'll touch on this document first and then I'll get into my presentation piece. But I did want to talk a little bit about the 10-year forecast and how we've brought this forward for council's consideration. The document that I'm referencing basically just summarizes by our divisions the 10-year totals for each type of capital investment. So you'll note in the first couple of columns where it talks about the division and then it shows the total project costs. So for a 10-year period, we're looking at about $252 million in capital works that's required over the term. And then the sources of funding are provided there as well. I will just draw your attention to the fact that, out of the 10-year forecast, we're looking at funding sources, including things like development charges or grants, but also reserve funds. And the reserve funds are a combination of a current year contributions and future year contributions, as well as what the balance is in there today. So it's just to kind of give you a bit of an overview about that. Based on what we're doing today and what we've got proposed in the 2022 budgets and beyond, we are looking at an overall funding shortfall for the 10-year period of about $9 million annually. So what that means is that if we are not able to bring up our contributions to reserves or find additional grant funding, then we will have a problem replacing and repairing all of these assets that we currently have identified in our 10-year forecast. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, just highlight that, and then we can come back to that as needed. But one of the challenges just remains is that we have a very large infrastructure base and a limited tax base at this point upon which to draw. So there may be some future decisions or current decisions that are required that will impact the overall asset plan. Okay, so really I'll jump into the presentation piece of it. It's short, bear with me while I summarize some of the things that have happened and where we need to go next. And then we can jump right into the review of the 2022 capital projects. So really what we're trying to do today is just update you all on the 2022 project list and the 10-year forecast. We want to take your questions and be able to help you understand what's being asked for 2022 and talk about the relative merits of the proposed projects and how that relates to the delivery of the service. So for example, if there are projects in the 2022 budget and council does want to consider either deferring them or removing them, then we will want to talk a little bit about what that means to the taxpayers, to the city, to staff, to all that sort of thing, and to council. And then we want to talk about some changes that are impacting the proposed budget that have happened since my report that I issued and since December 14th. And then just talk about the financial implications as we make changes to the proposed budget. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so as we talked about at the last meeting and with this report, it will take significant changes and ideas to make changes within the budget, especially if we consider sustainability as part of our decision making. Okay, historically, we're asked for input and opinions on what changes should be, but ultimately we're looking for council direction as to what services should be impacted going forward. So we've prepared the budget, capital and operating based on our current policies, previous direction, and established service levels. And we just ask that council consider the impact that the timing of capital projects has to the services. So if we do defer things, what that's going to do to the residents, to potentially to any service levels that they are expecting going forward. So, and how we can best communicate any changes that might have. So as you saw in my staff report a few minutes ago, we're sitting at about 7.9% with excluding the expansion requests. So it is a reduction from the initial figure of 8.6% plus expansion requests. The information is changing daily, so as we get it, we're trying to respond. Things like us receiving actual costing estimates, such as our insurance, even our benefits that are coming forward now. Departments are continuing to look for additional revenues or identify any other expenses. We're trying to consider the timing of asset replacement, not just looking at the fact that a useful life has been met or exceeded, but looking at the actual condition and whether or not the replacement has to happen right now or it can be later. We're also looking to respond to provincial announcements around initiatives, and obviously, as we're all trying to do, is manage the whole responses to COVID, including closures of facilities and all sorts of other things that impact us daily. So we're doing our best to keep up, but we do have to move forward with making estimates based on what we know today. So yeah, as you know, budgets represent the best estimates based on what we know today. So we're never going to get it perfect or exact, but we do have to try to consider as much as we do know. We've gone through a period of 10 years or more of low or no tax rate increases. So this finds us in a bit of a catching up phase for this year as well as for future budget cycles. So we consider that as we move through the discussion tonight, that if we do look at deferring projects or you know, trying to extend the useful lives of assets that are on the table now, that you know, it will eventually catch up at some point. If it's not this year, it'll be some year in the future. So we did see this a little bit in 2021 when some of our assets required immediate attention, but we did not have sufficient reserves to cover off those things, and we required on debenture financing for those. We continue to see it as we go into 2022 and beyond when we look at trying to cover those costs relating to that borrowing, but also financing current and future asset replacements and not just assets, but operational initiatives as well. So strategies that we've tried to use to mitigate or look at the impact of the budget. We don't typically recommend deferring projects or proposed levels of service, as this is how staff have you know, made the assessment. But there are some things that we can possibly consider. One of the things that as a treasurer, as an accountant, that I don't love is the idea of gapping certain costs. But there are certain times when that could be maybe considered. And one of those examples might be, and let me define gapping for those of you who may not know. We sort of use that term internally to maybe stagger the impact of certain initiatives or certain events. So for example, I'll pick on the expansion requests. If we know that those expansion requests won't take effect for the first 6 months of the year, then potentially we could look at budgeting for 6 months worth of the cost and deferring the remaining 6 months to the subsequent year. The impact of that, though, is the reason why we don't do it too often is because it does defer the financial impact, but not the decision making. So it does put that the financial burden on a future council and future ratepayers when in fact it's a decision that's been made currently. So anyway, that's just kind of one of the strategies that we do consider as staff. Like I said, if there's any sort of things that we have to consider, we also look at you know, additional cost pressures that are likely going to hit us in future years where we don't know what those impacts will look like in future years. So that's another reason why we don't really love to use that straddling strategy. But some of the things that we know are coming and that we see happen periodically is, you know, downloading from the provincial government, you know, surprises or at least unanticipated changes due to collective agreement changes or municipal, asset management directives that are coming down the pipe from the province. So even just, you know, directives that come from the province that have a financial impact and we don't know yet how to measure that. So just things to keep in mind as we move through this process. Next slide. So again, we've talked a little bit about this, and we will continue to throughout this evening is, you know, what is the impact if this project or that project is deferred, or does it have to be done in the current year? So sometimes deferring something for a year or two is possible without a whole lot of impact on the service level, but it is important to also consider the risks that go along with deferring. So some of those risks include things like the asset failing or breaking down, and sometimes that can be catastrophic to the service delivery. A plow truck, for example, or something that we have identified as being, you know, near its end of life, it potentially has the risk of failing completely. What that could mean is it can impact ratepayers or residents, but it can also impact the safety of staff, or it can impact the service level altogether. One of the additional constraints that we're facing right now with respect to acquiring services and products is the supply chain problem that COVID has introduced to us. So, you know, we might try to defer something, but if a breakdown or something happens during 2022 and we're required to look at fixing it right away, we may run into problems obtaining supplies or even services. So it's something that we may run into regardless, but it's something that if we get our procurement and our plans out early, then we can maybe get ahead of it, but just something to identify for council to consider. Some of the other things that we want to look at is where, like in the CAM staff do consider this when we prepare our budgets, is what are the costs of repairing and maintenance of assets when, you know, it might be approaching its useful life. So, you know, if we do extend it, if, you know, try to squeeze out some additional time frame out of assets that are slated for replacement, we can run into the option where the repairs costs or potential effective failure can be financially more expensive than had we proceeded with the replacement. So there's, you know, we consider where the reduced service level might result in community dissatisfaction or complaints. You know, I'm using my snowplow example. I don't think that's an issue for this year, but, you know, just kind of if we're not able to get out and get all of our crews out to deal with the roads, then we can result in some dissatisfaction. The other aspect that, you know, I try to keep it, you know, in mind is that any deferrals that we do for 2022 will be a future year inflationary impact that may or may not be significant, but it's just something to consider. So if things cost, you know, 2 to 5 to 10% more in 2023 than they do today, that's just another pressure that we have to deal with. And just pushing, you know, things into a future year can certainly impact, you know, what those future years look like. I touched on that earlier. So thank you. So as I mentioned at the tail end of the report presentation, there are a few other things that we've received some additional information on that we can propose adjustments for as well. I've highlighted these here. So we're looking at, as council had alluded to at the last meeting, the police have gone back and tried to find some additional savings or revenues, and they were able to come up with a bit of a reduction from their initially proposed budget. We're recognizing that due to the month of January and the COVID related impacts of that, the community services department is not going to see about $150,000 of revenues. So we're proposing that we make an adjustment for that. There's an employee benefit increase that I also alluded to that we've gotten some final numbers back from our provider on. So that's not a significant impact in a percentage basis, but it's a result of some of the changes that have come up with the collective agreements and from, you know, just our overall insurance renewal as part of that. Sorry, I'll call it benefit and renewal. And then another thing that we've sort of recognized is that in going through our current development charges background study that council will see in the next week or two, or we start to see, we've realized that there are some impacts that weren't correctly accounted for in the prior year development charges study with respect to how we repay the debt, and specifically it relates to the Agriplex. So we're able to find some savings in the community services department relating to that. So anyway, that's my long explanation. So another 0.3% reduction to the proposed levy increase. So we're sitting right now where this is kind of where we're at today. We started off with the 10.5 before council ever saw it. We made some internal recommendations and adjustments to get us down to the 8.6 starting point. And then after reflecting what's in the report and also this presentation, we've got it down to the 7.7% levy, like Stratford dollar levy increase. And after we look at blending the education tax rates and we look at our growth and our, you know, an expected residential tax rate increase will be about 5% where we're sitting right today and right now, if council adopts the recommendations within this presentation as well. So that results in about just under $20 per month increase on a home assessed at about $350. So we're still working with some assumptions, and we will continue to do that. Often we have to carry on into the year based on those assumptions, but other things that might impact our year as we move forward are some of the things that we don't know yet. Grant funding that hasn't been confirmed yet. We remain optimistic that there will be some COVID funding out there, but we haven't really received any indication that there will be. So we've been moving ahead without that assumption. And any new direction that we receive, any expansion requests that we want to look at, or any other ideas that come forward through our process can still impact the numbers I've thrown out there. And just as a reminder, I just took this slide from my last presentation. Some of the things that are not included in the 10-year capital forecast are listed there. this is not news, but just to have it in the back of your head that we don't have a lot of, I'll say, spare resources lying around. So if some of these or all of these want to proceed in the immediate future, then we're looking at some additional costing required. So this is another thing that I sort of borrowed from my previous presentation. And again, it's just a reminder, but it's essentially just summarizing that we're looking at the total amount being contributed to the 2022 capital levy of about 7.2 million, which represents just under $500,000 increase over the 2021 capital contributions. And that does make a bit of a dent, although not a lot, to address our $9 million annual funding deficit. So that's where we're sitting with that piece. So next steps, I'd like council to consider the recommendations that have been put forward in this presentation. We'll continue with our deliberations tonight and next week. And then we'll start, so tonight we'll start with the 10-year forecast, which we've talked about briefly, and then look closer at the assets by the capital assets by division, and then start into the operating budgets if we have time tonight. And if not, that'll be the next meeting. And then looking at final approval of the bylaw mid-February. And that's it. So if there's any questions particular to this presentation or in budget in general, I can take those now, or we can move on to the capital discussion.
Councillor Clifford. Thanks, Carmen.
Thank you very much for that report. Carmen, and I know we're going to get into the expansion after, but if the expansion requests were approved, it's almost a percent on top of that. Is that correct?
It is, I think it's a 422,000 and a percent is about 650. So I think it's about 0.75% roughly. If we did that. Now, as I mentioned before, one strategy for those new initiatives might be to look at just doing the 50% or gapping it, I'll call it again. We use our internal term, and just plan for half of a year for those new initiatives and then pick up the remaining half in the subsequent year. Again, it's not my favorite way of doing it, but it does represent a legitimate method when you're talking about something new.
Thanks.
Councillor Ritzma.
Thank you for the report. Just a question with regards to, I know you're dealing with averages and we're talking about homes that average is based on homes that are valued at $350,000. Approximately what percentage of the homes in Stratford would be in around the 350? I would imagine that there'd be more above that number, but
the figure that I used came actually not from MPAC. I bumped it up a little bit. MPAC determines that our median value is about 290. So that says that 50% of the homes are above the value of 290 and 50% are below. I used 350 because I think it is a little light. That said, there is, I will touch on this really quickly for your benefit as well as anybody who's listening. If people's houses or homes are reassessed as a result of the changing real estate climate and our assessment base, say, changes significantly as a result, that doesn't mean that people's taxes are going to double. It just means that it's like the way that we apply any budget that we need gets distributed a little differently. So it doesn't 100% translate into people's taxes going up, which is, I think, a common misperception out there.
thank you.
Councillor Seven.
Thank you. I just had a question. If you're able to, the 7.7 and then the blended rate is 5. Do you have the numbers from the last year's budget of what the sort of number was and then how it ended up with the blended rate? I'm just curious.
Give me just a minute here. I'll pull it up. I did include
sorry
that
to push on this,
in
but you can come back with that.
That was in the previous report as to give the prior year information in the slide where there was the 10 years were illustrated. I can lay my hands on it, but I'll need a couple minutes. But if you refer back to that.
I was just wondering. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm sorry, is there an answer coming on that or?
Oh, I'm not able to lay my hands on it right now. If I could get back to council, I will be happy to do that.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. Councillor Vasilakos.
I think I have it here. I think it went like 1.38% to 1.22%. I think that's a levy increase over prior was 2.02, and then estimated increase in total tax rate was 1.22. The year before that was levy increase over prior was 5.03, and then I haven't seen that. So there is always an adjustment down.
Yeah, you're consulting the right information. Thank you, Councillor Vasilakos.
Yeah, it's in our package. Yeah.
So just to touch on that the blended or the impact to individuals is made up of several factors. One is I'll call it the redistribution of assessment values that happens as a result of some properties getting assessed. It's a function of the growth that we've received. So we're able to include any new assessment that's come on board as a result of new development or new permits, that sort of thing. It's also taking and combining the overall impact to a taxpayer of the education rate. So that's still a bit of an unknown. The last number of years, it's remained fairly stable, if not decreased. So that's why sometimes the estimated increase at the end of the day is a little bit less than what we might expect when we do our levy increase, because it just depends on that. So that 5% potentially could drop if the education rate dropped again. I didn't count on that. I just kept it flat for the assumptions and the illustration of this. But once the budgets move forward and we're able to get final numbers from the province for the education rate, I'll be able to bring something forward to council regarding the tax rates and the overall impact. And we'll be looking at passing a tax rate bylaw separate from the budget.
Thank you. Councillor Clifford.
Carmen, I was going to ask, what is your projection on the growth? Because that's really important, I think.
It is. Typically the growth, any growth that we experience, I'll say lags on the financial side by a year or more, because we don't get to recognize that any impacts of that growth in the current year. So I'll preface my comment with that. As far as where I think the growth for Stratford's going to go, I really would have to defer to some of the other departments that are more involved in our economic development and in our well, not just economic, but development piece of things, where they deal with a lot of the subdivision applications and things like that, because I'm a little bit not able to comment on that.
Thank you. Did I see the mayor's hand earlier out of the corner of my eye? No. Okay. Any other questions for Carmen? No, thank you, Carmen. I see the CEO has joined us on screen. Is there something you want to interject?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So nothing specific. I will just say that we can put together some information, not for this meeting, but I will also preface that we will be coming to council and the public with respect to our development charges study, and there will be some projections and growth data recent that will be included there. So please stay tuned for that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question and indulge me. Are directors and other department people expected to make presentations tonight?
So if I may, through you, Mr. Chair, I think the intent was that we would walk through, or we would kind of guide council through the budget summaries. And then if there are any specific project questions, then they are here for, I'll say, subject matter expert weighing in. But I don't think we were really going to do much for the presentations. I think that perhaps IDS has a presentation that we can refer to if when we get to that point. But the intent was to just try to move through the process without tackling every single project on the list, and hope that council has, if they have specific questions or specific direction, that we can address that as we go through. I hope
Okay.
that helps.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ritzma?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, to the acting director, are there any, can you give some examples, or are there certain salaries that we can look at gapping that you could suggest a possibility of gapping going into next year?
Sure. So I was kind of, when I referenced gapping and I referenced salaries, I was referring to just about all of them on the expansion list, particularly the bigger ones that are new. I think there's a couple on there that are talking about changing from part-time to full-time, or increasing the hours. Those ones we probably want to look at implementing right away, but I think we could safely, modify the proposed impact by half. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. I would like to suggest that based on the draft capital budget presented to us in our binders and online, does anybody have any questions or want to start any sort of discussion? Councillor Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've gone through it here, and it seems that almost everything in capital, it's coming from reserves, or with few exceptions, it isn't going to affect the tax rate that much. Is that correct? If I'm correct, and I think we discussed this earlier. If you want to, well, how don't you talk about that to start with? I think that would be helpful.
Sure, I can try to address that. You're right. Because we're looking at a proposed 2022 capital budget of what, 39 million to sound about right, 40 million. We're certainly not relying 100% on reserve transfers, nor are we relying 100% on current year transfers to the reserves, but there is an element of that. So out of that $40 million, we're looking at, reference council to page, just go with the page 7 of the budget summary for 2022, where it's got some of the totals at the bottom. So I've got a total of about $40 million of total project costs. We're looking at funding about 8.8 million of that would come from grant funding, 794,000 from development charges, developers / any kind of shared costs or shared services at 570,000. So the remaining 25 million coming from the reserves. Now that 25 million is like we don't have entirely that amount of money in our reserve. So we are relying on the current year transfers to reserves to supplement our current balances in reserves. So to the tune of about $7 million is the current year transfer. So it took a long way to answer your question, but basically out of the 25 million that's coming from the city reserves, we're relying on almost 7 million from the current year. Which is just, sorry if I can continue with, is just under $500,000 greater than the prior year's reliance.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Vasilakos.
And so if I'm hearing that correctly, then we're not really doing anything to close that infrastructure gap that we have. In fact, we continue to make it worse. Okay.
If you look at making any changes or reductions to the transfers to reserves, then yes, we are going backwards in the asset management regard. That said, I know that, or I understand from several years ago when the asset management plan was first adopted, there was a sort of a desire to move forward with an increase to the levy relating to asset management. It's been sort of off and on, and it's been one of those things that's been a little fluid through the budget process. This particular proposed budget as it stands is getting you a little bit more back on track for that. But we still have some work to do in our long-term planning for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does any, your worship?
So as I look at the numbers that Carmen has presented, it really comes down to the expansion within the budget that we need to look at and what we're prepared to fund there. If there's anything to be cut other than that, there's only two places, and it's existing services or it is the capital that we're spending. So I think for all members of council, we need to think in terms of, do we want to expand services? If we do, then how does that relate to our asset management plan and capital spending? Or are there other services we want to decrease? And I think as we work through tonight, I'm not sure we're going to hear those, but those are the only three things, kind of the levers we have, which we're going to have to look at. Because, you know, the gapping, while good on a part-time to full-time position for 6 months, I hate to say it, is small change at the budget situation when 1% is $650,000. And if you're sitting just shy of an 8% increase now, you're looking at needing $5.2 million to get to zero. If 4 was where you were comfortable, you're looking at 2.6 million. And that is not going to come from gapping. That is going to have to come either from capital or serious service cuts in consideration. So I want members of council to focus on those areas when they're listening to presentations tonight.
Thank you, Your worship. Carmen?
Thanks for that, Mr. Mayor. That's a good summation of where we're sitting. One of the things too that, and please forgive me as we move through this discussion and we start to look at the individual departments for capital, if there are areas where deferring or moving something to a different year is feasible, I will certainly be able to comment on whether or not that makes any significant impact. But ultimately, the less than just under $500,000 increase to our capital reserve transfers for 2022 impacts the entire 10-year forecast by $500,000 a year as well. So if we're looking at making reductions to our levy from that area, then it's going to have a longer term impact as well. It's not just the 2022 impact. So I'll pipe in as needed as we go through this process, but just as a reminder for that.
Thank you. Councilor Seven.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, well, I guess first I have a question about the airport. I assume that land, the 480 acres, that's leased, or is that owned by the city? I'm not sure who I'm directing that to. I guess if the chief is available.
Through your worship, to my knowledge, unless somebody who's been around much longer than me in the corporation, to my knowledge, the city owns the 482 acres.
Okay, thank you. And I guess a couple follow-up. Am I right in understanding that the airport annually makes a profit?
Through your worship, no. So if we were making a profit, we would be cost neutral and then in the black beyond that. So what it takes to manage to have airport the size that we have, it costs us at the end of the day, after all the revenue that we make to offset those costs, it costs the city approximately 170 to 180,000 a year at the end.
Okay, thank you. I think I guess my question was if we own the land, it's probably an obvious answer, but there's probably not any excess land that would be. It just 480 acres seems like a lot, but I'm sure there's a lot of space needed. But I just was curious.
The chief would tell you that we lease the land to a farmer. The arable land is being leased by a farmer. So I guess we're getting some revenue from that. I know we've passed the contract or passed the resolution in the past making that so.
Yes, through your worship, you're correct. Pieces of the agricultural part, we lease out to maintain those areas of land and to gather revenue, but the ownership of the 482 acres is ours. Unless the mayor or somebody that's been on council a long time knows different.
Your worship,
Andy Woodham, the airport manager, is on. I think it'd be good if Andy was to kind of take some of these specific questions. I think it could provide a little bit more clarity. And Councillor Vasilakos, I saw she had her hand, but so if you want to defer till after she asks her question.
I just wanted to make a comment that I believe it was last year or the year before that we did have a council motion at budget time to come back with a report of how we could increase revenues at the airport to make it at the very least cost neutral. But I don't know that, I mean, perhaps the fire chief can talk a little bit about that. I don't think we managed.
Yes, through your worship. So right after that meeting, after we passed the budget, we also moved into a service delivery review. So we tied in whether or not we can make that cost neutral or making more money. We tied it in with that, and what the review came back with at this point was to start increasing the fees to what we could maintain without driving away all of our customer base. So we've done that this year, we've applied those increases from the service delivery review to see what the effect is going to have on our current customer base. But for cost revenue neutral or cost neutral, we were not able to achieve that at the service delivery review at this time.
thank you, Chief. Did Andy have anything he wanted to add? And I saw Councillor Seven's hand go up there again. Councillor Seven.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, and I don't know if this is information that would need to come back, and that's fine. I'm just wondering, do we know how many sort of patrons utilize the airport, and do we have the information on how many of them are residents of Stratford?
So through your worship, I would defer that one to our operations manager of the Stratford Municipal Airport, Andy Woodham. If Andy's able to jump on there, I see him as well, if he's able to unmute and take that question.
Sorry, I'm having some internet problems here, so I'm not sure whether this is going to work out for us now or not.
We can hear you, Andy.
Okay. No, I'm losing my connection. Sorry.
Andy, if you turn off the video portion, it might turn off other people's video. It might give you enough bandwidth so you can speak.
Councillor Vasilakos.
I seem to remember this correctly. Did we not at one of the last budget meetings decide or make a motion to review the airport and the financial feasibility of it and to refer that back for a study? I thought we did.
Chief.
So through your worship, yes, council did make that motion, and we started to get some of that information in from third parties. What the motion was is to basically to check on the costs out there, what it would cost for a third party study on the viability of the airport. And that report and all the information that's council requested to be on the 25th of January budget meeting coming up next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Seven.
Thank you. I guess what I'm sort of dancing around is the idea of whether or not the airport is something that I personally feel is worth the. I mean, it seems. I mean, 480 acres for something that. I mean, you know, I can't imagine that many people that are residents of Stratford, that the general population benefits from. It seems like a lot of sort of asset or whatever tied up in something that is not for the majority of people in the city, and I just don't know. I don't know how we would go about, or what the best way to sort of benefit from it otherwise would be, but I guess I just don't appreciate it perhaps, and I don't know what the process would be to go forward, but I think it's something that I would be interested in looking more into. I don't know if that's just my thought, I guess.
Mayor Matheson.
Well, and I appreciate Councillor Seven putting the cat among the pigeons on what he thinks with regard to the airport. To be really clear, it doesn't maybe necessarily benefit every person in the community using that airport, but there is an economic driver for that airport. And I know last meeting, some members of council said, well, they could go to London or they could go to Kitchener. But if you actually speak to the industries that use that airport for business purposes, and I think Mr. Woodham could tell us, in a regular year, it's some 1,000 movements, I think, that are coming in, and pleasure craft is somewhere around 4,000 movements, but I'd stand to be corrected. I think there's an economic benefit to it. And it's a sales pitch that we give companies that look to come here. And I can tell you that a lot of the factories that are here, people fly up from the US for meetings, they go back and forth. And I know everyone thinks it's going to go back to Zoom. I'm not sure the world is going to go back to Zoom completely. And I think you are going to see industry still need it. If you sell that 450 acres or 480 acres of land, it's a one-time savings, understanding that not all that land can be farmed. Some of it is woodlot, and it is in that area, and you will do it. It costs us $180,000 a year to have an airport that is very much valued in economic terms in the city's industrial growth. The other piece of it is used for emergency lifts with regard to Orange. They don't land at the airport, they land at the airport, they don't land at the hospital. So there is that question of where we would then have to work with the hospital to have an airfield. So I want us to think in broader terms, and we can cut $180,000 for the airport. But I think there is an economic value that the industries of this community that pay a substantial portion of the taxes find value in. And I send that out. It's just my opinion after almost 30 years on council and knowing the industrial growth and the people that are using it, that it is important to them.
Thank you, Mayor Dan. Chief?
Yeah, through your worship, if I could build on what the mayor just shared, it is very correct to say that it is tied to the economic part of the industry, not just in Perth County, but Southern Ontario. As we build on transportation, whether intercity buses, via rail starting to hit the area, having this airport of what the mayor is alluding to is tied to all of that, of what we can provide. We did have the economic impact study in 2015 provided to us from Dr. Woodsma and some of the students from the University of Waterloo. And some council members weren't there at the time, but they may still remember that report presented a $3.3 million economic impact to the city. Not everything feels it. A lot of it's tied to the tourism. A lot of it's tied to the recreational side. But every time there's an event going on in the city or the county or Southern Ontario, Stratford's different. You see a lot of these smaller airports, but the city of Stratford is very different when it comes to tourism. We have so much more to offer than some of the other places. And I just felt it was prudent to build on what the mayor said, is that it's $172,000 to have it, but once it's gone, it will be gone forever. So we have it right now, and it is something that I see tied to Invest Stratford for Joni Gerber's presentations around the world, Stratford Tourism Alliance. It's tied to so many things in this community, even though it's behind the scenes. It's not largely marketed, throughout the community. There isn't a big marketing push behind it, but I'm sure if it was, things may change and may help to get to that revenue neutral that some council members were alluding to. We haven't had the opportunity to make that big push, but it doesn't mean won't be an opportunity in the future to put more effort behind that. Thank you.
Councilor Ritzman.
And just to follow up and echo those comments, I know in my first term, I was kind of on the fence and probably negative towards the retention of the airport, but certainly that study through University of Waterloo Stratford campus and the economic benefit of the airport to Stratford, certainly I would be challenged to think that it would be a wise asset to divest of. So that's my history of it, and the information that we received. It made me a believer in that as a valuable asset to the municipality.
Thank you, Councilor Ritzman. Councilor Seven had his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I just thanks to the mayor and the chief and Councilor Ritzman for the information. I think, like I said, I just didn't appreciate it, but that certainly gives me a lot of perspective on it. And I wasn't looking to sort of short sale like the 407 or something. I just, and it's not particularly the annual year-to-year expense that I guess I was thinking about. But anyway, I appreciate that. And my other question about the airport, I guess, while we're on the topic, is have we ever looked at? Is there any possibility of selling lots, like to sever acre lots or anything for development in that regard, or would that be too close proximity to not able to do it? Or
so through your worship, we've had conversations with economic development in the past, and we continue to work with economic development to look at options like that at the airport as we move through these different budgets and capital projects. Many airports, whether small or large, they'll look at these options to whether it's a hangar, setting up a hub for local industries, especially larger commercial industrial businesses, that they can fly product in and out and use warehousing out there. There are many options when it comes to that land and what can be done with it. What it comes down to is expansion of the taxiways that allow access to the hangars or hubs that would be put out there. So there are some costs to that, but sometimes those costs can be shared. So out of that 482 acres, absolutely there is potential. There's always potential of what we can do within the confines of what Transport Canada allows us for how close you can be to the runways themselves and height restrictions. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Councilor Burback.
Thank you. Yeah, speaking of the costs of the airport, there is another cost, and that's environmental. And we do know that the greenhouse gas emissions, if we do expand the airport, will also expand. So my mind kind of goes to that land that we're not using, that's woodlot and perhaps agricultural land. Could that not be developed as sort of some environmental preserve that we could offset some of the greenhouse gases, maybe do some kind of environmental project? I do know that within the city of Stratford itself, I think that Quinn has told us that there aren't that many more places to be planting a lot of trees. So it strikes me as rather than renting out the land as agricultural, maybe it needs to be developed as some sort of nature preserve, environmental carbon sink offset, and possibly reducing some of the environmental costs that we see associated with the airport.
Chief?
So through your worship, yes, Councillor Burback, as the landowner, also there are some zoning restrictions that go through Transport Canada of what is allowed to be done or utilized of land on it that has an airport. So within that 482 acres, we would have to do some research through Transport Canada rules and regulations of what would be allowable on airport land, because it is governed under federal rules and regulations, which a lot of people don't know. But you still own the land. So that is something that we can look into if it's the will of council, and bring back options based on federal regulations.
Thank you. Councillor Vasilakos.
I think this is a really great discussion, but I think this goes back to my original motion to have a study on the economic feasibility of the airport. And I would certainly hope that a review, I think that a re-review is, I was on council early on when we had that initial, the students from Waterloo did the report, but I do think that it is timely to have a report that looks at the airport and looks at the costs and benefits, and also looks at the potential what could happen out at the airport to get us towards making it more economically feasible, or even just looking at the benefits as is. That I think that was my initial, like, we can talk about this all we want, but until we actually have something in front of us with options and possibilities, and we really don't know what we're voting on or deciding on.
Thank you. I went through the budget line by line this weekend. And one of the questions I have, I've never been in the retail business, but I know lots of people that have been in the retail business. And if you buy something for $1 to sell at your store, you better be prepared to sell it for $2, because that's the only way you're going to make money, is a 100% markup. So my question goes to, we buy $155,000 of fuel every year to sell. We better be bringing in $310,000 at the other end, or we're subsidizing the cost of the beeps to fly out of Stratford. So I would like to see us get closer to like reduce the amount of subsidy the city taxpayers is giving by just maximizing the opportunities from the users of the airport. So I'm a big fan of the airport. I think it has a great benefit to the community, but I just like to see the users making more of a contribution to the operation. So, Your Worship.
Why don't we stop going around? I'll make a referral motion that we ask the airport to come back with a revenue expansion opportunity to look at closing the gap on the $180,000, and let them, the experts, kind of take a look at it and see where they can do it. Councillor Gaffney, I don't think fuel prices at the pumps that you or I pay are doubled from what the fuel costs. I don't think the airport's the same way. And we have to be careful too. We don't want to be left with an airport where planes come up and down and go get their fuel somewhere else and fill up. And I'm sure that if the revenue's there, Andy will make sure that we get it. So why don't we turn it over to him and the Chief Parity to work with Carmen and come back with some revenue expansion ideas? Because I think that's really what we're talking about.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Ingram.
I'll second the referral motion, please.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? It's carried. Next topic. Does anybody else want to open or look at another department or division? Councillor Burback.
Thank you. Yes, I am interested in hearing from Mr. Krinkla, and I did understand that he has a presentation, so maybe that's where we're at. We can go there. I don't know.
Is the director available?
Hi, Chair. I think Director of Corporate Services has a comment to make.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand, Carmen.
Thanks, Taylor, and thank you through the chair. Just briefly, like one of the approaches that we could take is to work through the capital budget as presented by division, or we can start with we could start with IDS and Taylor's group and lead with that. It is one of the biggest budgets, so I'm okay either way. But that was sort of how I thought we might proceed with the capital discussion tonight. But I'm open to suggestion.
Council Burback, sorry, I was just looking at,
Well, that's okay. I think we should just go with what the corporate director wants to do. Like, let's just go through it in order. I was a little confused as to where we were at. It seemed kind of loose. So
yeah, no, I agree. Councilor Ingram.
If I may, you know, in looking at all of these budget lines, and unless there's something specific that somebody has any questions about beyond the airport, I wouldn't mind hearing the presentation from the Director of Infrastructure and Development, but I think probably we're not going to come up with any possibilities for cuts through this. Basically, there's only a few lines in community services that are affecting the taxation line. The rest of it is all reserves. So I don't want us to be spinning our wheels here trying to go through everything line by line if nobody's going to have any comments on anything beyond the airport.
Yes, thank you, Councilor Ingram. That's really why I was making it sort of open-ended. If anybody has a particular question about a particular item or division, I agree that going through the capital project detail forms page by page, if we're just speed reading through them. But Councilor Henderson, did you have your hand up, or are you adjusting your computer?
I was just moving my book around.
Okay. Do we want to hear from Director Crinklaw, and at the end of his, maybe I'll ask the question again, Councilor Ingram?
Thank you. So I'll move that we hear the presentation from Director Crinklaw. Just for information, I think he's gone to the time to put it together. So let's listen to it. And then beyond that, if no one has any other questions about any of the capital budget lines, I would suggest that we move on.
Thank you, Councilor Ingram. Can I get a seconder for that motion? Councilor Henderson. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Thank you. Please, Taylor, carry on.
Okay, thanks. And through the chair, not too many slides I prepared today. Just wanted to have a bit more of a formalized format of how staff plan to proceed with the climate change budget, or sorry, the climate change initiatives going forward in 2022. So let's see if I can share my screen properly this time. Give me one sec. All right. Share there. Settings. Does this work?
Yeah, I can see it. I hope everybody else can.
Okay, thanks. I got 3 monitors on the go here, so it's confusing which one to kind of keep in the right position. So, like I said, I've prepared a couple of slides today to talk over the climate change initiatives and staff's approach coming to 2022. So in terms of individual departments' focus, managing staff will continue to keep up with current sustainability and climate change principles and initiatives that are occurring in their own specific field. And staff will continue to employ council strategic priorities. So just we're always kind of keeping in the back of our mind, but specifically at a corporate focus, we're looking to establish an internal working group consisting primarily of managing staff. The main reason why I'm pushing for managing staff for this internal working group is that we're looking to develop an operational climate change framework That could be the first point of how we proceed going forward. And this requires furthering policies and internal procedures. We will also be keeping in contact with staff from area municipalities to see how they are putting the greenhouse gas plan into action themselves. Development of an operational climate change framework. So this is the focus for 2022. As we proceed with the internal working group, various policies and procedures will be identified as being required in order to adopt and utilize climate change greenhouse gas reduction plan. We will establish goals and objectives that are specific to Stratford with the intent to identify a baseline or at least a starting point for us, as well as methods to track success going forward. We will define measurements so that we are maintaining corporate consistency so that we ensure our approach is uniform in lines with provincial and federal frameworks. The working group will develop an initial list of potential subgroups, including things like waste and transportation, which are identified in the greenhouse gas reduction plan. It would also be good to develop a draft mandate for these working groups so that they align with corporate methods for measurement and ways that we can recognize success. Since projects and initiatives are always being considered, associated funding sources will need to be reviewed and analyzed as our approach may need adjustment going forward. And keeping consistency in the corporate approach includes determining what future reporting and auditing requirements will be required from the province in the federal government's future. So what we're looking to accomplish for 2023, and where we'll be starting at that point. The first thing is we'll be establishing sub-working groups. And this is where we anticipate the most action to happen as they can identify specific projects. Sub-working groups include things like government, building and land use, business, industry, transportation, waste, the natural environment, and agriculture. These are all identified in the greenhouse gas reduction plan. I'm assuming there might be more to come. We anticipate these smaller groups will be led by internal staff with the aims to achieve sector-specific goals. So who better than to push things forward than those who are experts in their own field. By this time, we may have already gone through a funding application, and this can be used as a template and assist us in future funding strategies. There are capacity and expertise limitations in our current staff complement. The working group would identify the resource shortfalls required to achieve the desired outcomes, and we would present this to our findings as part of the 2023 budget deliberations. Based on staff time assigned to the working group and the anticipated allocation of the shared climate change coordinator position, the city plans to contribute approximately $65,000 towards the climate change initiative in 2022. And so $20,000 of this would be for the shared climate change coordinator, and the rest would be the specific staff assigned to this working group. And each of their costs be absorbed by each department's natural operating budget. And if there's any questions.
Councillor Clifford.
Yeah, I was going to ask on these working groups or sub-working groups, would it be helpful to have a counselor on there? Like I've seen this happen before where we don't, and I don't know, I'm just asking you if that's something that you had thought about.
Yes, thank you through the chair. The focus for 2022 is just for staff effectively to figure out how to make this work going forward. The idea of the sub-working groups would be to identify specific specialties. And then at that point, I can see it being a potential mix of staff, managing staff, and even counselors for that matter, to help see that vision of how that specific item might be addressed. An example might be waste management at the landfill and how greenhouse gas can be reduced at that location and what steps we can take going forward.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. Councillor Henderson.
So the climate change coordinator that we share with Perth County, will they be able to attend these meetings? Will that be part of their mandate?
To the chair. I anticipate it will be. I've tried reaching out to Mayor only just recently and haven't had response back in terms of this internal working group. But if we do have that shared resource, my expectation is that they would at least participate in our internal working group going forward.
So my understanding is we're not planning to hire our own climate change coordinator to work on this full time this year.
Through the chair, some of these things will be figured out through the internal working group. Albeit, I think going forward 2023, if the idea is to be dedicated towards this initiative, then there will be resources such as a coordinator position being required at that time.
But that only needs us 7 years to get to our 2030 goal.
Thank you. Councillor Ritzman.
And thank you for the presentation. A question with regards to who would be the main driver or point person? Would it be the shared coordinator that will, ensure that things are moving forward? So maybe that's through your department, Mr. Crinklaw. If you could just expand on that, or I see the CAO's hand. Thank you.
So the chair, does the CEO want to answer this question?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, I'll respond to this one. So this is a corporate-wide initiative. So the drivers will be a corporate leadership team. The lead at this point is the Director of Infrastructure and Development, who's setting the framework. But this is a cross-departmental initiative that requires to be driven by corporate leadership team.
Thank you so much, Ms. Thompson.
Councillor Vasilakos.
So I don't know if this is more of it's a question and a comment combined. I know that our last strategic plan included the environment and climate change, and we have had none of the work that is being done by this working group precludes city departments from viewing operations or capital projects or purchases through a climate lens. So what I mean by that, I'm already looking at, when we're looking at the capital plan, looking that transit has already started to budget ahead for electric buses. The fleet management is already looking at hybrid and electric vehicles. So there are already initiatives ongoing with respect to climate change that are linked to our current strategic plan. And I know that we report those out in staff report that out now that we're part of the municipal climate change group. And so I just was perhaps, and I think Ms. Thompson can comment a little bit about what is currently happening at the same time that this working group works towards a more unified plan for the corporation.
Ms. Thompson.
Yes, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, I would concur with Councillor Vasilakos' comments. We do have the strategic priorities that we are working through, and we do report out on that. I would liken it to our accessibility obligations, where we have an accessibility plan, we have goals and objectives, as well as legislative requirements to address. And the way the city has dealt with that over the years is once we had the framework in place, we have embedded those in our day-to-day activities. So while we may not be reporting out specifically on accessibility every time, staff know their responsibilities and are addressing them in our day-to-day activities. And I see the climate change report getting to that stage as well, where it's just something that, again, it's just another area that we, in our day-to-day activities, we are always mindful of, and how can we figure out to address the requirements in our climate change, as well as the strategic priorities, which set the overall council direction for the city.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Councillor Ingram.
Thank you. And so how would this connect with the Energy and Environment Committee? Because I don't want to see a duplication of work or, overlap. I'd like them to, perhaps work in conjunction with each other. And I'm just wondering how that would work.
Through your chair. As the working group is only just just begun. We are still figuring out those nuances. However, like I said, for 2022, the focus is on internal staff and how we kind of make it work in-house. We have our own policies and procedures, whether it be funding, how we approach projects, how we address report and auditing of greenhouse gas reduction. There's a lot of components in here that kind of happen behind the scenes that need to be figured out and made consistent first before, or ideally so that we're reporting the same message through all our departments. When it comes more to actionable items and actual projects, that's when I anticipate those like sub-working groups would reach out to specific advisory committees like E&E and have those discussions then, or at least be available if they have any questions.
Thank you. Councilor Burback.
Thank you. And thanks, Taylor, for your report. A lot of my questions were already answered, but I am a little concerned about, you were talking about staff limitations and shortfalls. I know that our staff they already have a lot on their plate, and I'm just hoping that by putting this on there as well, that it won't be overwhelming or won't sort of get lost in the shuffle or off the side of the desk. I think that's the main concern with people asking for a coordinator, is just that somebody to oversee the efforts and kind of push them through. And from what I understand, you're saying that this year you'll be looking internally and seeing if that position is potentially necessary. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Through your chair. Effectively, yes, we'll be looking to identify our resource shortfalls, and that includes staffing.
Okay. I would love to see somebody dedicated to either reporting out or auditing our progress as we go through. We did commit to a 30% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions for 2030. So it would be really great if we could, that somebody will be keeping track along the way and sort of giving an annual update. I know that a lot of people in the public are really interested in it and would like to see at least some kind of tracking. And I don't know who within the working groups would be doing that, but I think that's one of the things that somebody, if there was a point person who was their job was to oversee this plan, that they would be able to do that kind of work as well. So that's where I'm a little concerned that we might be missing that.
I think I offer that the 11 people at the main table here will be making sure it gets done. And if we're not doing it, there's a vocal and engaged segment of the population that's going to make sure we're moving ahead. And if they're chasing us, we'll be chasing the director. So let's not spend a whole pile of money without having a better understanding of what the expectations are moving forward. Please and thank you. Councilor Vasilakos.
And I agree partially with that, but I also like to see sort of timelines and a little bit of reporting and status updates. And so, given that the climate change, given that it is council's responsibility to, or it was council's decision on the targets and council's decision to move forward with this, with what I have heard is supportive staff, could we possibly have an update on the status of the working group and where they are at periodically? You know, we could wait till the budget discussions of 2023, but I'm just wondering if the working group could provide, perhaps Mr. Crinclaw, could you provide an update on the work that's being done at one of the infrastructure, transportation and safety committee meetings? And then that way it gives, you know, gives us a formal way to actually track what's being done and what the progress is. And do I need a motion for that? I'm looking.
I would ask the clerk if that's necessary, or the deputy clerk.
Through the chair. Since I report to the IDS subcommittee meeting anyways, it wouldn't be much to add in a blurb regarding the progress of the working group.
Okay, thank you. Will that be all right with I see some head nodding going on, so Councillor Clifford and then Henderson.
Yeah, I believe you brought this up, but is there any grants, like Ottawa is behind this 100% with the greenhouse gas and climate change. If you heard anything, is there any grants available to municipalities to help with this?
Through the chair, there are several grants out currently related to climate change initiatives. Part of the working group is to figure out where likely we can best fit into such grants, because they're fairly specific of where you can actually apply for funding and at what stage that project needs to be at to be even eligible and what studies have to be done in advance. So I think hopefully building the foundation here will better put us in place for funding applications come 2023 and beyond.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Could we add that energy and environment gets there a monthly update also?
Through the chair, I'll figure out how to make that work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else on that particular item? Okay, now we will go back to the regular agenda, and point off what was commented on by a couple councillors. I'm opening it up to anybody that has any questions or concerns about anything in the draft budget. Councillor Clifford.
Mr. Chair, I was going to ask, are we going to have any motions on the capital, or are we just reviewing it and then we'll have motions after? I'm just curious what the format is.
I stand to be corrected, but our procedures are that anybody can make a motion at any time, with the hope of a seconder will step up, and then we can have discussion and vote on it like we do at any other committee meeting. So if anybody feels but of course I see the CAO's office or CAO hand going up, so maybe I'm in a position to be corrected.
Certainly not, Mr. Chair, but if it would help, I could ask the director to perhaps just formulate any types of direction that is required at this time. I know that there was an additional update with some changes that were part of the presentation earlier this evening, and I believe that we are looking for some direction to incorporate those proposed changes and the impact into the draft budget at this point. And then perhaps there are additional direction that we may seek later this evening after council has had a chance to discuss further.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Henderson.
I have a question on page 138, G7. It talks about the locker in the female change room are faulty and have been leaving a film residue on officers' uniforms. To date, several sets of uniforms and armor carriers have had to be replaced due to this residue. Maintenance has been attempted to avoid this, but has not worked. It's $15,000. Why wouldn't something like that just come under their safety so that it can be done right away? Why would this have to wait for budget? Wouldn't that be just like a safety failure of dirt on your uniform and possible contaminations? Just putting the question out there. I don't understand that one.
Is the deputy, or no, I see the acting director's hand go up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to presume to step into the police departments to comment on the specifics, but just as a general statement, $15,000 is getting to the point where we don't kind of have that kind of money just laying around, generally speaking, for many departments. So it's just one of those things that I think to highlight the fact that it's over and above what's built into the operating or maintenance budgets. That's probably part of the reason, but I certainly would ask the deputy chief or chief to comment on that directly.
Deputy Chief Foster. Oh, I see the chief's here too.
No, I was just going to defer chair to the deputy.
Thank you. I can answer that. Yes, we feel that the $15,000 is at the point where we should budget for that as a capital expense. The lockers, of course, would have probably a very long lifetime. The ones that are down there currently, we've had, I would estimate 30 years, maybe even more. So that's the reason for us putting it in capital as a request in 2022.
Thank you. Councilor Vasilakos.
I was just going to I had a little bit of a question around staff capacity in the projects and prioritization. And I only say that because I see that the McCarthy Road West Extension project is on there, but we have had a number of carry forwards from other years with COVID continuing and us having some, there are staffing challenges. This isn't so much a question about deferral for budgeting, because a lot of this, as we said, comes from reserve, and anything else we cut is sort of nibbling at the edges, and it's, it's small potatoes. But I'm just wondering if there's a comment around the number of projects that we have in the capital budget and our capacity to see them through, and whether there is sort of a need to prioritize. And it pains me to say that, because I'll probably hear from my husband about me putting this project on the lower priority. But I'm just wondering if we have a discussion around capacity.
Thank you, Councilor Vasilakos. Is the Director of Infrastructure still available?
Thank you, the chair. Big question, and I'll do my best to answer. So I guess the first thing to start off with, we had a few projects last year that were postponed due to being exceedances from previous years. So some of the projects that we have listed here are carry forwards from 2021. So the design work is already prepped and ready to go for much of this. We are still short-staffed a bit, so we are not operating at full capacity. So we do have a few items listed here that we intend to get to before year's end, but not potentially completely to the extent that's listed in the capital budget. So we aim to get there, but depending if we're able to get the hires that we're looking for, we might be able to expedite this. If not, it will just be put back into a carry forward to the subsequent year. So then I'll leave it at that. Is any other questions?
Thanks, Taylor. Councilor Clifford.
We've talked about this in the reserve, the 500,000 extra. In the past, we have put aside infrastructure dollars, and it how much is in that account that we have put aside in the past? I know as chair, I know we talked about. I know a couple of years we haven't, but is there a fund for infrastructure?
Acting Director Carmen.
Thank you. So I've been piecing this together a little bit since I arrived, but I've certainly been able to trace back the intent or the direction to increase our contributions for capital replacement overall. There is not a specific separate reserve directed for infrastructure, because typically when we budget, we do that on a division by department by division basis. So it's not something that is, if we raise, for example, money for infrastructure in general, then it becomes an allocation issue amongst the departments. So we've kept the budgeting the way that we levy for transfers to reserves, kept it by department, knowing that some departments in any given year will see an increase to the transfers to reserves and others will just stay flat. So we kind of internally, I'll say, play with who gets that adjustment annually. In the last couple of years, though, that those increased transfers have been the subject of the tax rate discussion increases and have not occurred regularly or consistently. So as I mentioned, for the 2022 budget, we're looking at increasing that by the 493. And I would say substantially that will impact the community services department, but there's a little bit of impact across other departments as well. Did that answer your question?
It answers it, but I don't understand that in the past, we have had dollars specifically put aside for it. And then annually, even if we didn't add to it, those dollars, they should be accumulating. I know I've asked you this before, so I am baffled. I know I've been on council almost 30 years, and it's happened twice now that we put dollars away. And I know we have reserve funds, but I am baffled that we don't have an amount like 3 million, 2 million, 10 million. I'm baffled by that. And I guess as ex-chair, it's my fault, but I don't understand it, quite frankly.
If I may, through the chair, this is something that, you know, I think we're sort of saying the same thing, but it's just how it's presented in the financial information. So each year, council sees the overall budget, and I'm going to go back, say, like the last 4 or 5 years, particularly, right? That they will see the capital budget presented, and then they will see the operating budget that contains transfers to reserves to support the capital budget. So if capital projects are cut and or moved or deferred or whatever, or removed for that matter, the impact on the operating budget may or may not exist, right? So if council, for example, wanted to cut or look at deferring a project in the 2022 budget, it could potentially impact the transfer to reserve figure or the infrastructure investment, I'll call it. We transfer annually almost $8 million to transfers to reserves out of our overall taxation. Of that, we're looking at 2022 being $493,000 greater than the prior year. So that number, that base contribution for infrastructure, it has increased over the last 4 or 5 years, just not as consistently as I think the previous comment was 500,000 per year. It just hasn't been at that same trajectory. But you do raise a good point in terms of, you know, where does that show, or how can you see the progress? And it is there. It's just not to the same, I'll say, consistency as 500,000 per year.
Thank you. I had Councillor Seven.
Thank you. Actually, the acting director spoke to that a little bit, but I just wanted to sort of clarify my understanding. We've sort of had talks about how in the capital budget, and I just think, so my understanding is that the capital budget is mostly out of reserves, but then I also understand that, for instance, especially for smaller projects, if we deferred projects or didn't go through with projects in the capital, then we would not perhaps necessarily not have to transfer the money to reserves then, so that would then affect the operating budget. So I feel like the idea is sort of I don't know, I guess I just feel like it's the idea of taking money from your savings isn't spending money, it doesn't count, but I think it does warrant us going through the capital, you know, not line by line, but perhaps sort of page by page. I don't know if that's the next meeting, but because it can potentially have an effect. It's just we're spending sort of, I guess, yesterday's money instead of tomorrow's, but I just wanted to, that's my understanding of it anyway.
Is there something in particular you want to point out, Councillor Seven, or?
No, I'm just speaking to, and I guess I'm not sure if tonight we're going through, or if because my understanding was that next week we would go through sort of more thoroughly through sort of
the expectations are is that you will look through the budget and you will pick out the items you think need to be followed up on. If you are suggesting that everything that's being financed through reserves has to be studied, I don't know if that's very practical use of staff time.
No, I was suggesting that we treat it sort of with the the same way we would treat the operational budget, whatever that is. And my understanding based on the agenda was that that would be, I guess, more next week that we would sort of go through, but I'll leave that up to everyone's discretion, I guess. But I just wanted to comment. I know there were comments about sort of not going through it, but I think we should go through it in a similar manner as the operating budget was all I was commenting.
My expectations are when we look at the operating budget at the next meeting, it's going to be approached the same way we're approaching the capital budget. You're going to read the operational budget and come to the meeting prepared to ask questions on particular items. But if council wishes to go through the budget line by line, then we will make that determination. I had Councillor Vasilakis.
So I was just going to make a comment, sort of just to contextualize some of this, that when I originally joined council and we talked about having that infrastructure levy where we would increase it every year, the point of it wasn't, the point of it was that at the time we had a $7 million per year annual infrastructure deficit, and that over time we wanted to close that deficit. I think the reality is that deficit's only grown. And so there is no place, the way I view it is there is no place for that fund to grow because we're using our reserves, faster than we can actually close that gap. And I think part of the challenges I have is we can go line by line on each of these infrastructure pieces, but we have to be prepared to then have a conversation about the risk that's associated with each of them. And there are risks, financial and from a liability perspective and from a service delivery perspective of not dealing with our assets and asset management. So I'll go back to the mayor's comment originally where if we're looking at the budget, it should be a holistic look at the budget, looking at service delivery and what services we provide, as opposed to looking to cut money out of those services, because then that increases our risk and creates risk to the services that we provide. And I know that's I don't know if I'm presenting it particularly well, but I think our job isn't to go line by line and say, do they really need a truck? Is it really going to cost us more next year? As opposed to that broader service delivery and what that looks like.
Thank you. I had Councillor Clifford next.
What Councillor Sutton was talking about in capital, though, I don't know if line for line would help, but at least in operating, I think we should go by department by department. I don't think, there's a lot in operating, and I don't know how other people feel. And I know we're going to talk about it. I'm not happy with 7 or 8 or 9% increase. So it is going to take some, and I don't know how the cuts will happen, but I think we do have to go by department, like infrastructure, community services, where we spend most of the money in the two, and social services. So I think we do have to spend some time in each department. And anyways, that's just my comment.
Makes sense. Councillor Ingram.
Thank you. So in the spirit of moving us forward, I'd like to put a motion forward that we adopt the capital budget in principle, subject to the referral on the airport.
Thank you. Would anyone like to second that motion? Councillor Beatty. Yes, please. Any discussion, Councillor Seven?
Thank you. So this is where I guess I'm a little confused. I just looking at the agenda, I thought we were having sort of higher level sort of questions to send back to staff and things tonight. And then a week from now, we would go through the actual deliberations of the capital and the operational budget.
I see the clerk has popped up on the screen. Madam Clerk.
So through the chair, so if I could provide some initial guidance, I will apologize. My internet is a little bit shaky. So if I cut in and out, please just let me know. But the intent of today's agenda was to begin deliberations and discussions on the draft capital budget and the capital forecast. With respect to the next meeting, we included information that we would be focusing on the expansion request, the operating budget, and then any remaining capital budget items that may have arisen from today. So if there is no additional discussion or deliberations required on the capital budget, then we could proceed with the motion put forward by Councillor Ingram and Councillor Beattie at this time.
In addition to that, I'm a bit caught up here too. If we approve the motion just made, would I want everyone to have the complete opportunity. If Councillor Seven so choose, he wanted to make a particular motion on a particular item, he'd still be able to do that? Or have we shut off that opportunity if we pass this initial motion?
So through the chair, this is only Finance and Labor Relations Committee. So any motion made here would still need to go to council, which naturally provides another layer. If there was a specific item to be listed for consideration, we could definitely review that and outline the procedures for giving that consideration.
Okay, Councillor Ingram.
Thank you. And I specifically worded my motion to say adopt in principle as opposed to approve, so that we leave open the option to revisit any additional items should we wish to.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Councillor Seven.
Okay, thank you. That answers my questions. As long as I was just, I guess I was concerned that if something came up at one of the other sections that we would be able to revisit it. So that's great. Thank you.
Acting Director.
Thank you. Just further to that, as we start to talk more on the operating and the service delivery part of things next time, there may be in fact adjustments that we need to make to our capital that supports those services. So absolutely, I anticipate that we could potentially be revisiting some of those specific line items as they relate to the service delivery.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions on the motion? Seeing none, I've got the deputy clerk jumping in.
Through the chair, sorry, just as the CAO mentioned earlier, there was a recommendation from the acting director of corporate services regarding the additional proposed adjustments. It was an impact of a decrease of $182,907. If perhaps this could be included in that.
That would be fine with me as long as that's okay with the mover and seconder. I see some head nodding going on. Okay, good. Okay, yes, please. So if there's nothing further, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed, if any, that carries. Does anybody have anything else that they'd like to discuss or bring forward? Councillor Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had a report a while ago and they had reserves on there. And some of the reserves, like the PEF, that goes back quite a while ago. Have we looked at reserves that are redundant or that aren't being used? And has that been, and I think I've asked this before, but I know we quite often go through these reserves to find out if they're actually of importance or if they're relevant. I'll ask our acting director about reserves.
Thank you, through the chair. That is something that I've been sort of tackling on an as needed basis. And when it crops up, I haven't been able to do a comprehensive review at this point, given the backlog of work in this area, in this department. I can sort of loosely comment on the fact that any of the, I'll say, uncommitted reserves or the ones that have been untouched for several years, for example, are fairly minimal. The dollar values of those aren't significant. The big ones that exist are our any deferred grants that we have, all of our capital related items for various divisions, and the development charges. And those are the more active ones. But there are a few, I'll call them smaller ones or less active ones, but they're not tying up a lot of funds that could be best used elsewhere. I would say that that number is very small.
Thank you. Councillor Seven.
Thank you. I did want to comment. I also would like to see the increase down. I think there's more families, households, businesses struggling, I would say, now than there have been in a long time financially. And I think I'm just wondering, I know a previous year, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but we had staff come back with options that were more of a significant impact on the levy increase. And I would like to see that happen again this time. I'm wondering if that would be a possibility for sort of have departments come back for the next meeting to give us options for things that would be more significant. I know we're going to go through page by page or department by department for the operating, but I think there might be more potential for significant impact if we do what we had done in the past year.
If I might paraphrase, I think what you're asking, would you like to make a motion requesting staff have another look at their budgets and see if they can come up with, ask them if they could come up with some more possible efficiencies moving forward?
Sort of. I guess not. I mean, I think that they probably have. I think I'm looking for things that we can do. And I'm not so much talking about deferrals as I am sort of, I mean, it's obvious that our financial situation is not really sustainable, to say the least. And I think if we could look at have staff look at sort of services or anything that they think would make a significant impact, even if it is for just this year or potentially year over year, I think that they would be able to do a better job sort of showing us what would be more significant than we may be able to. So that would be sort of what we're looking for.
Councillor Ingham.
Thank you. And I appreciate the comments from Councillor Seven, but I think, the comments from staff at the very beginning of this meeting were that they had gone through their internal budgets many times over, trying to find efficiencies and trying to look for ways to cut their budgets. And they're looking for council direction at this point. I think it's going to come down to us looking at what they have provided us, because I think they've done pretty well everything they can do at this point. And they provided us with their best effort. And so it's going to come down to us making a decision on how we want to move forward. And, I really do not want to continue to go back to staff and request time and time again that they look at their budgets when we already know that they've done it, many times over.
Councillor Seven.
Thank you. And I do appreciate that. I guess, we've been in this position before where we've started budget deliberations and staff have already provided us with sort of their best and their most efficient, and then we've asked again and we've been able to get things down a little bit more. And I think the trouble is, and what I struggle with is that the more difficult the financial situation gets for a city or a household or anybody, then it's usually a case of the harder it gets, then the more willing or the more push there is, then there is certainly more that can be done. And I think we need to, there are so many people out there compared to the last years. It's certainly a different world than it was when we were meeting in the council chambers during budget deliberations, which we were able to bring the increase down. And so, I'm gonna go ahead and make the motion. Hopefully it's clear enough to have staff departments look and come back at the next meeting and give us options that we would be able to, you know, whether to bring the number down more, because I'm not comfortable with the number where it is. I think we'll end up somewhere where that's probably higher than is ideal, but I think if we can meet somewhere in between where we are now and where we would ideally be, I think that would go a long way to helping. You know, there's so many people, you know, seniors and lots of people on fixed income. People's incomes are not going up. You know, inflation and everything. I don't have to go on about that. Everyone's sort of aware, but yeah. So that's the motion I'd like to make, please.
I saw the clerk show up. Is there something she'd like to say or no?
Through the chair, no, not at this time.
Do I have a seconder for that motion? Councillor Clifford.
Yeah, I'll second it to get on the floor.
Okay, I saw Kathy's hand earlier. Councillor Vasilakos.
Sorry. My comment on this is we do it every year. And I think we do it, and the fact that we've done it every year has landed us in the situation that we are now. So we go back to staff every year and say, find an efficiency. But I think what finding those efficiencies has been punting the problem down the road to where we get in the situation. If you look at that table that the Director of Corporate Services provided, is that it's caught up to us. And I think our responsibility at this point is we either accept that we are actually this year sort of paying the price of having punted and having constantly asked staff to find money that erodes services, rather than having a conversation ourselves around broader service delivery and the big picture. And I only say that because quite often the money they come back with is things like using part of they're short term. They're often, you know, there's a little bit of gapping. There's a little bit of taking from the parking reserve. There's all of these little things that makes a number better every year, but it only hides the fact that every so often this is what happens, and we end up with it'll be, I guess, 5% overall. And it's not just us. I've seen other municipalities do it, where you tighten so much, then you have a year where everyone has to go, oh, and I think after 7 years of this, I think that's where we're at. If you look at the nibbling of the 0.5% here, 0.5% there over the last 7 years, where we've managed to maintain service levels with, you know, some cuts. I think if you add up all that, that's where we are right now.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe Stratford has acted exactly the same as other municipalities in our area. We have done the same. I went through from London to Toronto, Chatham, County of Wellington. The increases are 2%. Toronto is 4.4%. Chatham is 4.74%. Obviously, and you know, we talk 8%, 5%. We really have to talk like other people are talking. Our increase, if we put in the expansion, we're going to be around 8.5%, depending how many people we hire. So the reality is, I like Councillor Seven. I can't support a motion like this. I don't think we've done any different. And I was chair, and if we had done different, and it's my fault, but I don't think we have. I think we have to get this tax increase around 4%. And we might have to have fewer flowers. We might have to hire fewer people to do flowers. We might have to hire fewer people at the cemetery, but we can do things that's not going to affect the average citizen in Stratford. So I believe there is places to cut, and I believe it's our responsibility to find places. Obviously, we have to give our staff ideas what they can do. But I believe the increase we have here, and I don't blame staff for it, but it's unacceptable. It's simply not acceptable in my estimate. And I think we have to go through each department. We have to go through community services. We have to go through infrastructure and find out where we can have some savings. So that's my comment, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. I had Councillor Beatty and then Councillor Seven.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to do a simple echo of Councillor Vasilakos. I think she did a very eloquent job of conveying what I'm going to try to share as well, but I just want to add my 2 cents to this. Contrary to Councillor Seven or Councillor Clifford, I believe our staff recommendation is adequate, and no one ever wants to hear that your taxes are going to have to increase, period. I don't want to have to pay more than I have to, but I also don't believe that I want to reduce services, nor do I believe we can continue to, as we've heard, punt projects down the line any longer. The time has come. You pay me now, you pay me later. The time for us is to pay. Unfortunately, whatever number we finally settle at, is probably going to be short than what we should be at. I believe at a house of $350,000, if we're looking at an increase of $250 per year for that house, I believe that is a price to pay for the quality of service, the quality of life that we have here in our community. Again, people who I chat to will say that they're willing to pay their share. Again, not that they want to, but they acknowledge the fact that we have this community that we are so proud of, and it comes at a cost. And we can no longer continue to nickel and dime it. So cutting flowers isn't going to cut it. We need, if we're going to make any big cuts that are going to make a meaningful reduction, then you better find a big project, because throwing this task back to staff to find a few projects is not going to do any real change. So I challenge this council, either we make the hard call and accept what we need to do here, or simply find a big project that's going to make a meaningful difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Seven.
Thank you. I would just like to, I guess, respond. So there's a big difference. There's a big divide, and there's in that, you know, there are certainly people in the community and people in the city that are willing to, but on the other side, there are people who cannot pay the extra. So there are people who have the extra. They can choose if they want to or not. You know, they'll support it because they can pay it. There are a big chunk of the population, businesses, families, who cannot increase the payment for various things, including a tax increase. The other thing is, I think we should, as a council, go through the budget. I think we need to do our due diligence and go through, as we do every year. I think we need to also, though, in addition to that, refer to staff. I think what I struggle with is, I mean, speaking of chat, I don't know how, you know, if we're willing to accept possibly a 5% or more increase for the residents of Stratford, for people who cannot pay extra, but we're not willing to ask staff to revisit their reports, and as we have previous years, I feel like that certainly does not sit well with me. And I think as, you know, the people out there who are not able to and don't, you know, they obviously don't have the control, or that can't make the decisions, and we tell them they need to pay more, but we weren't willing to ask staff to have another look. I think that doesn't sit well with me. So I think we need to ask staff, and I think we also need to do our due diligence and go through this budget as we have in previous years. And I think that this year is more, we should be more prudent, not less. So I guess those are my sort of final thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Seven. Councillor Ritzman.
So certainly I'm concerned for those individuals that that are currently struggling. I look at our tourism sector that's been hit the hardest, and individuals that are trying to maintain a business and or trying to make a living at that business. And so I agree with what Councillor Seven has put forward with regards to asking departments to review budgets, but certainly to get to where we need to get to, we're looking at finding, and I know if we push departments, they're going to find some monies, but to get to where we believe we're going to get to, we're looking at $2 million, and I don't think we'll find that. So as Councillor Beattie spelt out, it will require us looking at a major project or one or two major projects and say, okay, what are we doing with that in order to get to the percent increase that is doable for a large number of our citizens that are struggling. That's where I believe we need to go. We can't avoid not looking at those big projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ingram.
Thank you. So just one final thought, and that's all you will hear from me for the rest of the night. You know, again, we're talking about the tax base, and when I'm looking at the capital project, and we are only talking about the capital budget here right now, like next week is the operating budget, and we will be going through that department by department or page by page, however you want to do that. So we very well might find efficiencies there. But when I'm looking at this capital budget and I'm looking at the tax base, there is very little we can remove from this capital budget that is going to affect the tax rate. And, you know, if we want to increase our reserves, then that's a different discussion. But we're talking about the tax rate right now, and everybody's, you know, concerned about what that number ultimately is. And there's very little in this capital budget that is going to affect that ultimate number. So, you know, like, I think we're going around in circles here at the moment. So we need to think about the operating budget next week, and then that will perhaps determine what that final number is. But for right now, tonight, we are only supposed to be talking about this capital budget. And I think we've determined where we sit with the capital budget.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson and Councillor Vasilakos.
I have a question. I see Mackenzie Street and Argyle Street's back in the budget, and they've increased it. I believe it was $2 million over budget last year. So we didn't do that project. Was that actually taken off the tax rate? Because that happened later in the year. And if it wasn't taken off the tax rate, why is that not just carried forward because it was already budgeted in 2021? Can you explain that to me? And that's just a minor one that I'm looking at. There's other ones.
I see the Director of Infrastructure has popped back in again. Do you have a response to that, Mr. Crinklaw?
To the chair. Actually, I think Carmen, I'll let you go first, and then I'll help if I can.
Acting Director.
Thanks. I can maybe try to address that. When we talk about the capital program, all of these projects are not technically linked to the levy or to the tax rate. So if we have them included in our program for the 2022 year or the 2023 year, the funding of those is what's connected to the tax levy. And all of these projects, I would say every department's projects, are a combination of the current year transfer to reserve and existing reserves that are there. Forgetting about grants and, you know, development charges for the at the very moment, but the balance of what's required comes from a combination of not just the current year transfer, but the prior year. So if a project was budgeted in a prior year and there's sufficient reserves available to fund that, as a, like on a, just looking at one project say at a time, then absolutely we're not re-levying that number. What we're trying to do is say that we're levying $9 million, $7 million or $8 million on the levy for capital, but we're doing $40 million worth of projects in the year. So necessarily some of those funds are already previously raised, but some are not. So I don't know if that helps at all, Councillor Henderson.
Yes, I forgot that mostly the capital budgets come out of the reserves, so it would just not come out. Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Councillor Vasilakis?
So just a comment, are we on item number 7 of the agenda? Because if we are, 7.1 is giving, so feedback, comments, questions, and direction on items for the draft overall budget. And I was assuming that that would be direction that then we can add to deliberations. Is it next week or, yeah, next week. But I'm gonna go,
That's what we've been doing.
okay, that's why I just wanted to be clear so that it can actually, it doesn't include just capital, it just can actually can on feedback on operating as well. I just want to go, just reiterate that I just think it's our responsibility to go through that operating budget. It's our responsibility to decide service levels. That's what our responsibility is. And so we should be, but I also want to make a comment around, we often get stuck on the percentage, but a number and talking about the taxpayer. But then I think at some point we have to sort of step back and ask ourselves what citizens get from our budget and the services we provide, and the fact that social services supports families that are struggling as well, and that we in keeping our budget increases below a certain amount to keep the tax levy below a certain amount, which benefits the tax homeowners. And again, the municipal tax base is the most regressive of all of them, so it's not helpful. But my concern is then at what point do we start eroding the services that then disproportionately affect those in our community that have the least ability to, I'm thinking about, housing, transportation, transit, those kinds of things. And the people in our community that rely on those services and get more value from those services back than they are paying in taxes.
Okay, thank you. I think we've sort of gotten to the point of exhaustion unless Councillor Clifford has something he.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's exactly what Kathy just brought up. We are talking about 7.1. And like I was going to say, if the majority of council is happy with an 8%, I think that's what we have to, I think that's what 7.1 is about. Majority of council, like Councillor Petey, is happy with this, then this is an easy budget. If majority of council is not happy, it's going to be a combination of council and staff that are going to make the cuts. Council is going to make suggestions. Staff are going to say we can do this or we can't do this. And we've done this every year I've ever been on council. It's what we're doing is quite normal. I've seen in the old days would come in with, to start with a 13%, would get down to 8%. So what we're talking about here is a normal budget deliberation.
Okay, I'm ready to call the question. Yeah, no, I think we're ready to move ahead. But okay, Councillor 7.
If I could just clarify the motion. So I just wanted to be clear that the motion is for staff to provide options that we would then discuss and approve or decline. So this isn't about staff making decisions on council's behalf. This is about staff providing us with more options to bring the budget lower.
Councillor Henderson.
I just wanted to bring up that, lots of people can look at, say, Kitchener or Toronto and London and see their budgets are maybe a bit lower than us. But we have to remember, like, we're a population of 31,000 and what, I think it's 11 homes, and I forget how many, 11,000 homes, and how many businesses. In Kitchener and London and Toronto have a lot more people paying taxes. So yes, they have more expenses and things, but they also get more grants, and that makes a big difference. It's hard for a little city like ours to give everything to everybody that they want and still keep our taxes below 3%. It's very hard.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. I will call the question on the motion. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That is defeated. Now going back to what Councillor Clifford said a few minutes ago, he's right. I wonder if it's time to ask the question, and I'd look for somebody to make a motion if it's necessary. That as a council, are we happy at 8.6%, or are we going to move in a different direction? I've got Mayor Matheson put his hand up.
Can we please do the operating budget next week and do the justice as opposed to circumvent and say, okay, the tax increase is this because we're not going to do the next week. Let's take a break for tonight, come back next week with fresh ideas and walk through it. We've been 2.5 hours, and I think that's probably the most prudent thing we could do.
Yes, thank you. Is there anything else anyone wanted to discuss before we move on? Seeing nothing. Item 8, upcoming meetings. January 25th at 5:30, next Tuesday. And then Monday, January 31st. And I will look for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councilor Burback, second by Councilor Seven. All those in favor? Carried. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.